Hey there, YoProKnow audience. I have a question for you all today. How many of you have been told your entire life to always keep your resume updated? Now, how many of you have actually kept your resume updated? Is your resume collecting cobwebs somewhere in the back of a notebook that you kept in college? Before I got involved in any of this work with YoProKnow, mine certainly was. If any of this sounds like you as well, it might be time for you to see a pro. Luckily for you, we actually know one. Stacy Mailer should be a familiar face for those of you who watched her story with us on our podcast and video series a couple of months back. She owns her own company, Next Level Career Coach, and has an array of services for you to check out. When you use any of her services, you'll actually get a 10% discount when you say you're a part of the YoProKnow audience, which I'm very excited to offer. So what are you waiting for? Your resume is definitely waiting on you. Hey there, everyone. It's Camber here with the YoProKnow. I am sitting here today with Shannon Falon, a 32-year-old investment associate at Equitable Facilities Fund in New York. Thanks so much for being here, Shannon.
Thanks, Camber. I'm excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. Before we get started on your background, I do want to just mention, I always like to share how we were connected to all of our interviewees. And so although we weren't connected by a previous interviewee, Casey is a friend of mine, somebody I work with through the local Chamber of Commerce here in Greenville, where Shannon spent some time a few years back, and I'm sure she'll cover that today. But just wanted to share that was the connection here. So Shannon, without further ado, if you wouldn't mind just giving us a background, where you're from, what you're currently doing, and then we'll dive into more of those details.
Sure, thanks, Camber. So I'm from Florida. I was born and raised in Florida. Have taken a couple sojourns, different places, college in California. But now you said, and what do I do now? Is this where you want me to go through everything in between, or just the?
Why don't you go ahead and just say what you're doing now, and then I'll prompt you.
Okay. So I work for Equitable Facilities Fund, which is a nonprofit social impact fund that makes loans for schools.
Great. So naturally, my next question is, how did you get there? Where has your career taken you? And of course, try to be as concise as possible. But when we take a step back and we kind of look from above at all that you've done, what are some key points in your career that have led you to this current job?
Sure. Yes, happy. It's kind of a funny journey.
They always are. That's what I love to hear. Let's hear it.
Yes. So I graduated in 2010 from the University of Southern California. That's where I went to undergrad from Florida, which was a journey in itself. There, public policy. I had an internship with actually Governor Schwarzenegger. Nothing about him or his administration, but that showed me that much like your own personal story, what I thought I was going to be doing, which was working in public policy, was not the right fit for me. So I had to make a really quick pivot my senior year. It's 2010, big recession, but Teach for America, if people are familiar, was a big recruiter at my campus. Teach for America is a nonprofit that recruits recent college graduates to go into public schools and teach students, from kindergarten all the way up to 12th grade, different subjects, with a focus on schools in inner city areas, underserved areas that can't recruit teachers. And that certainly comes back into my life a little bit later, which is why it's important to mention that I spent 3 years teaching in a Title I school in Jacksonville, Florida, kids who dealt with all sorts of different social issues that, a lot of us don't get exposed to. It was very meaningful and impactful for those 3 years. I taught high school math. During that time, I always knew teaching wasn't my lifelong ambition. And I started exploring grad school programs, realized that I wanted to make a transition to the private sector. Did some research, found the business school at the University of Florida. That was great for me because it was good for people making transitions from, non-private sector, non-business to business. Mm-hmm. There I studied finance, explored some different career opportunities, and ultimately got connected with Wells Fargo, who had an MBA training program in their commercial banking group. And from there, so that's how I ultimately ended up in Greenville, was getting a job offer from Wells Fargo. They really focus on placing their MBA candidates in markets where there was a good team in place to train them. So that's how somebody from Florida without any connections to Greenville ended up in Greenville. They had a good experienced team there. And really that's where I spent 4 years, where I've learned my trade, which is making commercial loans, which I can get into a little bit later.
Yeah.
But I enjoyed my time in Greenville and at Wells Fargo, but I did start feeling limited in scope and opportunity there, which is something that you might find in finance,
city.
In banking in a smaller city. Exactly. And then also, this was a personal thing that I miss feeling like what I was doing every day was having an impact. When you're teaching, you go into the classroom and you see those kids' faces and you know whether you're succeeding or not by how they're doing. So I miss that meaningful impact. So I kind of concurrently started looking for opportunities in New York, where I knew, that's the finance capital of the world. I knew there would be opportunities in finance for me to grow in that field. And very fortuitously, I happened to run across this role with a nonprofit that was taking the skill set I already had in lending and applying it to education and working with schools and kids. So
I love that. I think that and I'll pause really quickly. I think, hearing your progression and where you've come from, you started in education knowing that you didn't want to be a teacher your whole life. You knew that wasn't your dream job. And then finding your way back to that is really, really cool. So I love hearing that. So at the risk of, interrupting and pausing where you were, tell us, what does your day-to-day look like now, and how do you apply what you learned in your day-to-day now?
Sure. So generally what I am is a lender. I was a commercial lender with Wells Fargo. I'm still a lender, but now instead of making loans when you look at what commercial lending is, it's people working with businesses, with the people who run businesses, really learning that business's story, and getting comfortable making loans to them. I did that with businesses at Wells Fargo, and now I do that with schools at Equitable Facilities Fund. So my day-to-day looks like, usually it involves conversations with schools that I'm working with, research in the background, so they can't give me everything through a phone call. So I'm accessing public data, I'm looking at financial statements, put together a story about these schools that I work with, and a lot of team interaction where I'm going and taking all this work I did, getting to know a school and understand their story, and I'm presenting it to my bosses, and we have different boards and committees that make approvals. And what I probably missed in between all these conversations is there's quite a bit of synthesizing and putting your thoughts down on paper and making reports. So that's my day-to-day now. That was really my day-to-day pre-COVID as well. I'm very lucky that my job is still here, that it hasn't changed, with the one exception that now two exceptions really. I do it from home, and it used to involve a lot of travel. We were on the road a lot to meet schools. It's a lot of Zoom.
Yeah, no, I would imagine. Well, thank you for, again, giving us that full recap. I think I always enjoy interviewing people who are 30 and above, because our interviewees, it's probably an even split between 21 to 29-year-olds and then 30 to 39-year-olds, because those two groups make up the young professional network. And so I always enjoy listening to people who are older than 30, because likely they've had a few different careers, and again, seeing all of the careers kind of come together to where you are now is always really fascinating. Sometimes it's like completely different than what they started off as, but I like to see the consistency as well. And so I really appreciate you sharing that. So one question that I always like to ask interviewees is, what has been a hardship for you? Looking back at the last 10 years of your career, where have you found your biggest hardship, and what have you learned from that?
I think my biggest hardship has been, and always is, feeling stuck, feeling like I'm capping out in terms of development in a role. I like to always be learning. I think with a lot of young professionals, they start to realize that they've got choices to make between being a very a specialist and a generalist, which is gathering more knowledge and widening out their space. So that's been a hardship for me. That's one of the reasons I did decide to leave Wells Fargo, is I felt like by no means was I an expert at that job. I worked with people who did that job for decades and was lucky to learn from them. But I wanted to learn more, to widen my skill set, as opposed to just, become the absolute best at what I was doing. I wanted to have a greater impact by widening what I was doing.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something, honestly, that I'm facing even now in my job, which I love my job. I love the people I work with, and I'm lucky in that they encourage me to go beyond what my day-to-day is and provide opportunities for professional development, where even if it's not my day-to-day, they support me learning about it, because it makes me a better professional overall.
That's great. And how big is your team?
Very, very small. It's about 10 people full-time.
Okay.
So it started 3 years ago, and it's
Okay.
a pretty small startup environment, but with very lucky to have quite a bit of money to get going.
Absolutely. Well, I am mindful of our time today, Shannon, so I want to ask one more question. I think I might throw in another one, but want to know, what is your take on the future of education? Obviously, in the current state of, our world, education, there's so many hybrid versions right now, depending on where you live. Some schools haven't even started yet. What is your take on it from your lens?
With specific focus on COVID's impact right now?
You can talk about you can answer that question however you'd like.
Great. So I think right now it's hard. I just see it every day. It's hard for parents, hard for kids, and it's going to impact kids. And I worry about essentially our society, that we have this whole generation of kids who are missing critical time in the classroom. I think that is valuable. I will say, however, kids are resilient. Parents, for the most part, they love their kids. They invest in their kids. They want them to do well. And teachers are some of the hardest working people you're going to get. So I think it's a resilient industry, if you want to call it an industry, in terms of what's happening now. In general, the future of education, I think, is bright, because every day there's more and more people choosing to invest in it from different angles, whether that be going into teaching, going into ed leadership, going into, policy making, or being a legislator. There's certainly divergent forces acting on education, and it's being pulled in different directions. And I think it goes hand in hand, if I may, kind of broach this topic as well, with Black Lives Matter and recognizing a lot of social inequity in education, and more and more voices and eyes coming to the table. So I think with that, there will be progress overall, but there's still a long way to go in terms of education and everyone getting a good one.
No, absolutely. But I think it's important that you, being in the sector that you're in, and seeing what you see every day, I think, and just going back to the 10 years of experience that you've had in this area, it's promising that you say that there's hope. And so I think that's what I'm hearing from that, but there is a long way to go. And I think that's not a secret to anyone. So I really appreciate you sharing that and touching on some, kind of sticky topics for some people. And I embrace those conversations in these interviews, because that's what's making up young professionals' lives today. So it's very relevant. So with that, Shannon, are there any last minute pieces of advice that you'd like to share with the audience today?
Advice, or I would call it my lessons learned. Don't be afraid to make a change if you're not excited. I always felt content and fine, but I wasn't excited. So don't be afraid to make that change, take a chance, and find ways to just continue learning and bettering yourselves as professionals. It doesn't all have to happen within your job.
Great. I think those are some good words to end on. So Shannon, thank you so much for your time today and for being on the O for No.
Thanks, Camber.